you've done a lot of
Sorry,
work on this one, Jack, and like what are the allegations against Kirsten Cinema and the Association for Prescription
prescriptions.
Psychedelics, who I think former Congressman Mimi Walters is doing a lot of work with?
Yes. So, obviously, shameless plug and highly recommend checking out my Friday feature for Double Blind Magazine last week, which details at length the uh, two separate complaints that have been filed, both with the Office of Congressional Conduct as well as the DOJ, about the former being specifically about former Congresswoman Mimi Walters of California and the organization that she is a board member of called the Association for Prescription Psychedelics, and the latter being a Department of Justice complaint involving one Kirsten Cinema, former Arizona senator, Democrat turned independent slash pseudo conservative lightning rod, and avowed ally of the Ibogaine lobby. So, to give the most efficient summary that I can possibly give, the first complaint with the OCC involving the APP centers around the preeminent release of a PATH caucus, the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies Caucus, formed by Congress through the Crenshaw Amendment, the first piece of federal legislation that really put federal dollars towards psychedelic research, helmed by one Dan Crenshaw and also by AOC. So the Crenshaw Amendment creates the PATH Caucus, and in August 2024, the PATH Caucus puts out a request to the public seeking expert information from from involved industry stakeholders, experts, advocacy leaders, etc., and then goes the additional step of creating a series of working groups in which, over the early course of 2025, a number of gatherings were had in Washington with, as I said, industry stakeholders, advocacy leaders, key lobbyists, representatives from pharmaceutical organizations, etc. This is what's called an RFI, a request for information. And all of the advice and counsel and input and recommendations and chitter chatter that goes into a PATH Caucus working group report is then compiled into a more efficient report and eventually distributed both to lawmakers and, in turn, the general public, outlining what these industry stakeholders and the relevant parties involved in Congress have to say about what some reasonable recommendations might be for federal psychedelic policy reform, not unlike a task force, as we've covered and talked about earlier in this episode. Here's where it gets dicey. So the Association for Prescription Psychedelics and Mimi Walters stand essentially accused of getting their hands on some of this data. It's worth noting that they likely contributed to the RFI, given that they're at the forefront of this and are their membership comprises of almost every major psychedelic pharmaceutical company you can think of. They're essentially a trade group for psychedelic pharmaceutical companies, psychedelic biotech companies. So reasonably, you would expect that they would give some information for this RFI that would, be involved in the creation of these PATH Caucus working groups. The allegation that's been made is that the Association for Prescription Psychedelics somehow managed, allegedly, to get their hands on the full working group report prior to its release, both to lawmakers and to the general public. How that happened, not really sure, but they're alleged to have done that and then used that data to host a series of private briefing sessions or listening sessions with relevant stakeholders at the key government agencies, the VA, DEA, DOJ, etc., congressional staffers, and the allegation essentially is that they used this data, passed it off as if it was their own design and creation to curry favor with and potentially, gain influence over, in the offices of key bureaucratic stakeholders. We've talked a little bit before, Joe, about how a key focus of warring factions, if you will, in the race to psychedelic, policy reform here in DC, at the federal level, is who's going to get there first. That's one of the biggest concerns. It's not necessarily, how do we build the most cohesive coalition possible to advance the most collaborative and full-threaded framework? It's who's going to get there first. So any edge that you can get, presumably, really makes a lot of sense. So that allegation has been made, and a formal complaint was filed with the Office of Congressional Conduct. Some might wonder, why is Mimi Walters, a former member of Congress, subject to oversight by the OCC, which oversees current congressional activities and members of Congress? The general idea behind filing the complaint with the OCC, based on my conversations with the whistleblower who filed this report anonymously, to be clear, is that the OCC oversees the PATH Caucus. So any misuse of taxpayer-funded data generated and compiled by the PATH Caucus, would, in theory, be subject to OCC oversight. So that's part one of the allegations made. The second complaint was filed anonymously by a different whistleblower who leaked this complaint to me. Both were leaked to me exclusively for my reporting for Double Blind Magazine. The second complaint filed with the DOJ centers around Kirsten Cinema, former Arizona senator, now heavily involved in lobbying efforts surrounding ibogaine policy reform at the state and federal level. What's notable is that Cinema, by appearing at a Senate roundtable event that was hosted here in DC back in December 9th of last year, as well as by speaking at a state hearing in Arizona last fall in support of ibogaine research legislation, appears to have violated what is, a mandatory 2-year cooling off period for former members of Congress in being involved in any lobbying activities, period, state, federal, whatever. Blanket 2-year cooling off period. Definitely something that plenty of people across the vast spectrum of the political realm are fairly fast and loose with. But this complaint comes at a perilous time for Cinema and for her credibility within psychedelic advocacy circles. Those who might be unfamiliar, she's also been recently subject to a lawsuit from the ex-wife of, I guess, her current or potentially former romantic partner, Matthew Amell, who is also an ibogaine advocate involved in advocacy efforts with Americans for Ibogaine, as well as, I believe a former patient at Ambio Life Sciences down in Tijuana, Mexico. They met because Amell was working for Cinema. They've been accused of having an affair, and she's been sued under an obscure North Carolina law known as the alienation of affection law, I should say. That led to the revelation of a number of things. We won't get into the dirty and sordid details. I highly recommend checking out coverage that already exists. However, it is worth noting that in the fallout from that lawsuit, Cinema was also accused recently of spending well over $700,000 in campaign funds after she'd actually left office. Campaign funds are often stored in a political action committee or organization, designed to support reelection efforts, kind of always raising money for that when you're in Congress. And there's often a lot left over. It can be distributed back to the, whatever national organization for them to use on other elections. You can give it to other candidates directly. You can't really just spend it on things, right? Unless it has something to do with actual politics and actual electoral politics. Cinema was found by the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan campaign finance watchdog group, to have spent I believe over $250,000, $300-something thousand in just payments to former staff members, including thousands of dollars to Amell, her former bodyguard / alleged affair partner. Not even alleged. She actually admitted to the affair recently in the latest court documents. So the most recent payment, and I think this is really worth noting, that was paid to Amell from her campaign finance fund was $9,000 last October. 9 months after Cinema left office, she's still allegedly, not even allegedly, these are things that are registered and filed with the necessary federal, governing bodies. This is stuff that's on the record. This is how she spent the money, right? So whether or not it's legal seems to be up for interpretation from the federal government if they should so choose to investigate it. But on paper, it looks pretty sketchy. So why does all of this matter? I've rambled for 5 minutes about this now, so I will wrap it up in a neat bow. Why does all of this matter? Let's get to the heart of it. I have long said that the political arm of the psychedelic renaissance will be remembered as one of the most consequential political movements of the 21st century because of its interdisciplinary implications across any number of facets of society, bureaucracy, etc. And I think what we are witnessing in the broad scheme of psychedelic coalition building, both at the state and the federal level, is an unprecedented level of bipartisan investment and involvement in simply addressing mental health crisis, the opioid crisis, any number of public health crises that are afflicting the American populace at large. And in the process, certain pragmatic decisions are being made that I think I really believe, closely mirror a lot of what has gone wrong in the decline in popularity of the Democratic Party at large on a national level over the last decade and a half in particular. And I think we're seeing a shift towards the invisible, moderate position that's leading to being fast and loose with background checks on key and prominent political allies, and a lot of top-down decision-making that leads to both short-sighted policy, but also the co-optation of policy priorities to a select few upper echelon donor class of constituents, if you will. And that's why both this matters, because I believe fundamentally that anybody interested or invested in the future of mental health care in general should be tracking the politics of drug policy reform at large. And I believe the most important thing you can be is thoroughly informed about how these systems of change are being enacted. And then secondly, people who donate their time, their money, and their emotional support to these movements should be informed as to who the allies, the organizations they're dedicating their support to are really involved with. And I think regardless of whether or not someone might pass it off as needless infighting or highlighting of squabbles between internal faction parties, I think it's really important that people know who the organizations they're entrusting with the future of this multi-generationally consequential movement are really in bed with, in action, in allyship, and at times in direct financial and monetary exchange, right? So that, and it also leads to highlighting all the more the importance of what's happening in states like New Mexico and Massachusetts and Colorado, where a constituency is building out, a more democratized framework for how the underground economy there is actually operating in the confines of legal decriminalization of personal use and home cultivation. It's why highlighting the few pockets and examples of coalition building that sticks and leads to an enhancement of policy innovation, the development of the Treatment Equity Fund, the integration of indigenous practitioners and ceremonial offerings into the future framework of the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Program. All demands made reasonably by a concerted effort from grassroots coalition members that extend across the socioeconomic spectrum, that we find a pretty vast disparity in diversity when we talk about who's really backing psychedelic policy reform. So that is a hefty 9-minute monologue off the dome about why all of this matters. And I hope that we can get some great clips from that to really help inform folks, because it might seem like, oh, this might not go anywhere, so it doesn't matter. Even if the OCC doesn't move on this, even if the DOJ doesn't move on this, people that are interested or even invested in any way, whether it's at the local level, state, federal, a lobbyist or not, you're just somebody who gives $25 to an organization involved in one of these, many a scandal, at the end of every year because it's tax season or whatever it may be, you should be informed. And to decry that as highlighting little more than partisan squabbling and infighting, I think is short-sighted and dare I say a bit manipulative of organizational constituencies. So end of rant. We're a solid 10 minutes over. Joe, any other thoughts or comments or questions for me, or about all of the above?
No, let's just keep watching it and see how this plays out. I think it's important when federal and state investigators are looking at campaign spending and issues around lobbying. We should carefully pay attention and make sure we're doing the right thing with our attention and efforts and money. Because we want this thing to unfold with as much integrity as we can, and hopefully have the best result for the most amount of people.
Yeah. And on a closing note, like these, I've seen no evidence that these competing complaints have hindered or impeded progress at the federal level. I think that we're going to see some really, to tease a little bit of what I do know to be coming soon, we're going to see some really interesting progress at the federal level as far as psychedelic related innovation when it comes to policy. And I am confident that these scandals should be illuminatory for the reasons that I've laid out, but they will not ultimately be a hindrance to progress in the immediate future, which is, I think, a hopeful note to end on.